Well, welcome to the podcast today. My name is Jeff, and I'll be your host. And my guest today is Richard Liverance. Richard has become a friend of mine over the last few years. He's the former Western Regional Marketing Director for the Government of Israel Ministry of Tourism in Los Angeles, California. He passionately educates executives and advisors within the travel industry to promote travel to Israel in his former role. And as a pastor and a Bible teacher with over 25 years of experience, he especially emphasizes the importance of Christian and Jewish travel to Israel, the land of the Bible. Richard, welcome to the podcast today.
Great to be with you, Jeff. It's really fun to spend a few minutes just talking about Israel.
Well, I look forward to hearing a little bit more of your background. We've, chatted in the past, but I think every time we meet, I learn a little bit more. So we're going to just jump in, have a bit of a conversation here today. And at the beginning, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself. When did you first take an interest in the land and the nation of Israel?
Well, that would have to be when I was a boy, actually. I grew up in a nominal Christian home, but was led to Christ at the age of 15 by a friend of mine. And I grew up in upstate New York, and I had a lot of Jewish friends around me in my school. So I had, went to bar mitzvahs, and I remember one of my friends taught me a Hebrew song when I was, 12 or 13. That was kind of fun. But it was when I came to Christ at age 15 that I really immediately had a love for Israel and an interest in Israel and a love for the Jewish people. And I noticed a marked difference right away in my life. Just so many things came alive, of course, when you come to faith in Christ. And you love the Scriptures, you love the stories of the Scriptures. Of course, so many of them are placed right in Israel. And I began just reading as much as I could of the Bible and just loved everything about it. So I think it goes back that far for me. And then I cultivated that, obviously, in my college days. I joined a Bible teaching church and who loved Israel, and I continued to cultivate my love for Israel. And then when I became a pastor, I took my church on trips to Israel to expose them to the land of Israel and to just study the Scriptures on the site where those things took place. So I've just, for many years now, have developed that and loved Israel. And so it was sort of a natural thing for me to work for the state of Israel. And it was really something I think the Lord really opened up for me. It was in a sort of a transition in my life. And Israel at the time was looking for a Christian who could reach the Christian community, because that's the number one market to Israel are Christians coming to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. And so they hired me. I was available, and I was able to, because I had a pastoral background, able to reach out to pastors and make the case of how important it is for pastors to go, and then also for pastors to take their churches as well.
That's fantastic. I listened to your story, and I love hearing sort of everybody's experience when it comes to Israel. Myself, I was also born, raised in a Christian home, and grew up in the church, became a pastor, but it wasn't until I was a pastor for almost 20 years that God really flipped the Israel switch in my heart. And it's just so cool to hear that right from sort of the get-go, you had that love and that passion to know more about the land of Israel. I understood, all of the sort of Israel references in the Bible. I knew it was a real place, all those kind of things. But for whatever reason, that spark hadn't ignited in me until I actually went in 2006. Yeah. And so everybody's experience is different. Now I know what your answer is going to be, but I want to hear you say it for the people watching, listening. What's unique to you about the land and the nation of Israel when you compare it to, say, traveling to Europe or Asia or some other part of the world? What's unique for you?
Yeah, I've traveled a lot. I've gone to in Asia, South America, South Pacific, Europe. I've traveled a lot in my life and seen a lot of wonderful places. But Israel is by far the most fascinating and interesting. And I'm not saying that just as a pastor. Working in the Ministry of Tourism for several years, I met people from various religious backgrounds, and they all had the same thing to say. I mean, some were religious, some were not. Some were Christians or Jews or nothing at all. And many of them said, listen, I was not religious when I went to Israel, and I thought, well, I'll go. But they said it changed my life. There's something about Israel, and I think you sense it when you get off the plane. It's like you've entered into a place that has so much history. You feel the weight of history when you step into the land of Israel, and it's really quite remarkable. I think what makes it unique and why it was such an honor for me to represent the state of Israel in the United States and Canada. I was able to be in Canada, which is where we first met, actually, at a conference in Canada. Yeah. And so all over North America, I traveled and was able to be a representative of the state of Israel, working for the government of Israel. It was a fantastic honor for me. And I don't think I would have done it for any other country, honestly, because Israel, of course, is the very centerpiece of God's redemptive plan. Now, his redemption is around the world, and all of us who have put our faith and trust in Christ have become a part of that redemptive story. But the centerpiece of that redemption is the land, the people of Israel. And so that's what makes Israel so fascinating, and especially for people who are Christians, who are believers, who come to Israel. You are in the center of God's redemptive plan. It's not just a historic plan. It is a historic plan, but it's a plan that's now, and it is a plan that will still be. And so you're spanning past, present, and future of God's redemptive plan. And to be in Israel, it's like you've entered the story yourself. It's so fantastic. So I can't imagine promoting any other country than Israel. And even though I no longer work formally for the Ministry of Tourism, I think my life will continue to promote Christians coming to the land of Israel because of how fantastic it is to be here and to be right in the centerpiece of what God is up to in redemption.
Yeah, absolutely. You answered my next question before I even got to it, about why it's so important for people, especially Christians, to travel to Israel. And, we sense and feel the weight of all of those things that you mentioned. And, Ministry of Tourism, they're smart because they know that every Christian they get to the land of Israel will become an evangelist for traveling to Israel. It's one of those things that just is kind of undeniable. How does standing in Israel, when you're physically there, how does that become standing with Israel? What's the connection there, and what's unique about going that really that connects our hearts forever to the land and to the nation?
It opens your eyes. Coming to Israel, we grow up knowing something about Israel. If we grow up in the church, we've read stories, and we know Israel in the news. But it's still sort of, even from a biblical standpoint, Israel's sort of a literary thing. And I think a lot of people don't realize how real the stories of the Bible are until they step into the land of Israel. So people don't have this idea of it's a biblical place. It's sort of part of the story, fine. And then they hear it a lot about in the news, that sort of thing. But to come to Israel, it opens your eyes, not only spiritually, biblically. I mean, people's lives are changed because they deepen their understanding of Israel of the Bible rather, when they come to Israel. But also, they see modern Israel and seeing how modern Israel operates, who it is, who the people are, their role in the Middle East, I think is really an eye-opener for a lot of people. And they don't realize how important it is. And so when you come to Israel, you are standing with Israel in a sense. People come, they don't know, they're not sure. Maybe they think Israel is a little suspect because of some of the bad news feed, and they don't know what to expect. But when they come here, they see Israel, they see what's going on here, and are surprised by it. And they recognize its role. Being in the land of Israel is probably the best way to support Israel because you come with your money. you support Israel financially. It's the best way to do it, honestly. And not only are you receiving the benefit of learning Israel, but you are also blessing Israel with finances. But it's interesting. You become a part of this Israel story, and when you come to Israel, it's like you've stepped into the Bible, yes, and you become a part of the biblical story, but you become a part of Israel's overall story. Even in just a week or 10-day trip to Israel, you're experiencing some fantastic things historically, also modern Israel. You're understanding its important role in the Middle East and in the world. And I think all of that's really important to opening people's eyes to what Israel is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about meeting the people and rubbing shoulders and doing business and all of those kinds of things that really do connect you. And I mean, I can say for myself, since that first trip in '06, I've been back over 20 times. And I can never wait to return. You know, it broke my heart to leave early. The last time we were there, we had planned to be there a little bit longer.
Right. I remember that.
But because of, Omicron and everything that was happening, we just sort of felt it wise to get back home here. And, very ironic, though. You think about all of the concerns with traveling these days and COVID and everything else that's been happening. Last year I traveled to California. I went to British Columbia here in Canada for a week and a half. We traveled to Israel, and then we came home. And we got COVID in our house on Christmas Eve. So, you can take all kinds of precautions, but it doesn't really matter. I think that on that subject, at least, I was joking with my son. He was saying about us traveling, and don't you worry. And I said, think about how we got COVID. You brought it to our house. So the whole family had it. We quarantined. We did our thing. We're all feeling better, and no
That's
big
good.
deal. But anyway, I want to get back to what we're talking about. Israel is often referred to as the crossroads or the center of the world. You look at some of those ancient maps where Israel was portrayed as the very center of everything. Is that appropriate, and why is that appropriate?
I think it is. I know that map you're referring to is, I think, from the 1500s. A German guy who wasn't really a cartographer. He was more of a theologian, and he made a theological map of the whole world that was like a clover leaf that represented from his city in Hanover. He has Africa, Asia, and Europe, and then at the center, Jerusalem. And I always loved that because, as a matter of fact, they have it here in Jerusalem at the city city hall. They've got that map in mosaic or in tiles, I think, and you can see it right here in the center of Jerusalem. It is an appropriate map or idea that Jerusalem is at the center of the world. It may not be geographically the center of the world, but it is, I think, theologically the center, as we've talked about it, the center of God's redemptive plan. Historically, in ancient times, Israel was the crossroads. It is at the bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and every major empire in the ancient Near East and Europe sort of marched through there and left their mark. Today, it's not so much the same because there are other centers now of interest, but Israel is still at the center of world news, which is fascinating to me, that such a tiny little piece of land could still create such a ruckus in the world. It's really fascinating to me. It suggests that there's something up here, that it's at the center of this divine drama that's taking place. And I think that's why it's a place of wonder. And we all know the stories of Israel, but it's also a place of conflict because this is a center where God is up to something very important. And he's going to have his plan take place in and through Israel, and there are forces that are against that, and so it creates a place of conflict as well. Yeah. So yeah, I think it is definitely a crossroad. It's definitely a center. I love a passage in the scriptures actually in the prophet Ezekiel, and he says there in chapter 5 of Ezekiel, he says, "This is Jerusalem. I have set her at the center of the nations with lands around her," something to that effect. And now the whole passage is quite a rebuke, actually. It's a judgment, but that's such an interesting statement that the prophet makes. It's actually God saying this, that he set Jerusalem in the center of nations And I think that's a deliberate act of God in order that Jerusalem and what his plan was in Jerusalem and in Israel would affect all the other nations. It still is doing that. Well, this was, 600 BC or something. It's still doing that. It's still impacting the nations. Israel's role in the earth today is absolutely vital, and it continues to have such an impact. It's essential for the stability of the Middle East. Israel is, as well as I think the rest of the world. If you think of Israel fell, what would happen not only in the Middle East but throughout the world? So yeah, it's very much a center. It is very much still. It was in ancient times and is today very much a crossroads.
Yeah, totally agree. And, we also, from a theological or eschatological perspective, we look at Israel kind of as the timepiece in God's calendar as well. Whatever's happening in Israel, we can understand, what God is up to in terms of his sort of eternal plan and bringing us to end of days, which, as believers in Jesus, we look ahead to. And so watching Israel is one of those key things.
Yeah, keep your eyes on Israel. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Richard, you're living in Israel now. Critics of Israel and groups with anti-Israel leanings, they sometimes, actually more often, accuse Israel of being an apartheid state, which is a term that just drives me wild. But how would you respond to someone who accuses Israel of this?
Well, apartheid is a separation or segregation based on race. And I guess people who claim that about Israel have absolutely never been to Israel. Israel is a very multi-ethnic place. The Jews for the past 2,000 years were scattered all over the world, and when they began coming back, they brought their cultures and their ethnicities with them. It is very diverse here, and you see, first of all, every color of person here living in society and partaking in all the freedoms of society here. You have all sorts of languages being spoken. Jerusalem is a very international city. I'm surprised walking around. You see people from all over the world speaking all kinds of languages. Every color of person or every shade of person on earth is here, and many of them came from Jews. There are Arab Jews, there are African Jews. The Jews spread from Asia to the Americas, to Africa, to Europe, and they all came back with those ethnicities. So it's really not true about Israel at all. Israel has given freedoms and rights and freedoms to people of all kinds of backgrounds. Mm-hmm. They usually say that in regards to the Palestinian conflict, but there are Arabs living, and Muslim Arabs and Christians and Jews all living as Israelis in Israel, and somehow it works. I mean, there are issues, obviously, and there are conflicts, but overall it works very well. And I think the news doesn't really highlight in Israel the cooperation that is going on between Israelis and the Palestinians, and also between Jews and Muslims, and Christians and Muslims, and Jews and Arabs and everybody. There are all kinds of things going on to bring understanding, to bring peace, to bring cooperation, both on the business level as well as on other levels as well. So it's really, I think the charge of apartheid against Israel is simply one of ignorance. People who haven't been here and they're listening to what they heard on the news, which is rarely the truth, honestly, and they really don't know the real Israel.
Yeah, it becomes a convenient sort of term or position for those who are anti-Israel, especially in other parts of the world. I just find that it fuels the rhetoric, and that many of those people really have no idea what Israel is really about. And, I love the talk about the diversity that exists in Israel proper. That is that, there are just so many different people from so many various parts of the world, and many, many Arab Israelis as well, who, the majority of the ones that I talk to are quite happy to be Israeli. And I suspect that there are many Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip who would probably enjoy the freedoms and everything that Israel offers as a nation. And so that apartheid thing
Absolutely.
never ever smacked with truth
No, it's
to me. It's
yeah.
just again, it's a convenient kind of rhetoric. Now, Richard, you're doing something that is enviable for some of us. You are currently living in Israel, not just in Israel, but in the city of Jerusalem. How is Jerusalem specifically unique among the cities of the world where you have visited, where you've lived? Talk to us a little bit about your experience so far.
I love living in Jerusalem. I live in the old city of Jerusalem as well, which is sort of a dream come true. It just worked out when I got here that there was an opportunity opened up. I live in the Christian quarter, just inside the Jaffa Gate, and it's a fantastic experience being there. To walk these old medieval cobblestone alleyways and to experience the culture that's around every corner. I'm in an Arab community. Arab-speaking Christians, close also to the Muslim quarter. I'm close to the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter, and I get around. I walk all over the city, feel very comfortable doing so. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic cultural experience to be in Israel. In Jerusalem. It's such a fascinating city to me. When I first got here a few months ago to start my program at Hebrew University, I just had to keep pinching myself, thinking, I can't believe I'm here. It is such a fascinating place religiously. I'm right in the midst of it, and I hear at 4:30 in the morning, I hear the Muslim call to prayer. And then about 6 o'clock, the various church bells start clanging and and ding donging, and then you just realize that when you hear that, you're realizing that all of this religious diversity is coming together in this one city. It's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. I think what makes it so wonderful is the history. It goes back thousands of years. I mean, there are places in Jerusalem, in the old city, where you can see things from the first temple period. That's 2,800 years ago. Things from the time of Christ as well, 2,000 years ago. The walls of Jerusalem, they're from 1500s, but some of them are still on the footprint of the ancient walls, even from the time of Christ. So it's just fantastic to be in Jerusalem. It's an interesting city, religiously, historically, fascinating, and the culture there is just wonderful. I love being in Jerusalem. It's really quite an experience.
Yeah. Well, you're preaching to the choir here. I also love being in Jerusalem. And last week we interviewed Dan Bahat, who used to be the district archaeologist in Jerusalem, and Dan has written extensively on the city of Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount, and just brings such amazing perspective. And so if you're watching, go back in the archives and find the interview with Dan. You will enjoy his perspective on Israel and his story about how he came to the land as well. Now, Richard, you are, we mentioned at the beginning, you're formerly, working for the Israel Ministry of Tourism. Currently, you are studying archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So tell us a little bit, what are you studying exactly? Why did you choose archaeology, and how's that going so far?
It's actually a 30-year-long dream of mine to live in Jerusalem and to study at Hebrew University. And it just happened that it all sort of opened up for me this past year, where I was able to do it. And I thought, you know what, I'm gonna follow that dream I had 30 years ago and study archaeology at Hebrew University. I was a pastor for 25 years. My background is theology and Bible. I love teaching Bible. And I've always wanted to bring a little bit more context in terms of land of Israel studies and archaeology to my understanding of the text of Scripture. And the Hebrew University has just started a new program in biblical archaeology that focuses on the Bronze and Iron Ages, which corresponds to the patriarchal period and the Israelite period of Israel, essentially. Mm-hmm. of the Hebrew text of the Bible. And so it's an enormous amount of information, but fascinating. And we are going through all of it. We get that. We've got ancient Near Eastern languages. We have pottery studies. We have labs and science studies. We've got on-site visits. We've got an archaeological excavation as well this summer coming up. It's just a fantastic program and really giving us an exposure to not only history of archaeology in Israel and other places throughout the Levant and also Mesopotamia and Egypt. We get kind of all that up into Turkey as well. We in the Mediterranean, we get all of that exposure to all of that, but focusing primarily on the southern Levant, that is Israel, Palestine area. And it's been absolutely fantastic. I can't imagine. It just sort of turned out that I was able to do this, and I'm so thankful to the Lord because of what He's doing in my life through this program. It's been fantastic.
What's been some of the most enriching or satisfying moments so far? Studying this semester in Jerusalem.
I'm fascinated by. I'm always, as I'm sitting in class, I'm always thinking, of how God has providentially led human history. It's so fascinating to me. In the scriptures, we get, of course, the whole, not the very details of every nation, but we get the whole idea of God's plan for humanity from the beginning and the separation of nations, and then the consummation and everything. We have the redemptive plan through Christ. But I sit there listening to, we do a lot of study on not just the Israelites, but the Canaanites, the Philistines, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamian, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and all these other nations surrounding Israel in the biblical story. I'm just so fascinated by all of these cultures and how they interacted with Israel and how they interact in the biblical story. And seeing God's sovereign plan and how He leads nations. We have this fascinating course on Canaanite religion, and we're looking at like Baal and some of the Canaanite pantheon, and we're looking at the temples of the Canaanites, like at Hatzor up in northern Galilee, amazing place where they found all kinds of temples and Canaanite cultic things. But it's just interesting to me when you think about the biblical story, how quickly people and nations who once knew of the one true God went away and went off to these other, following after these other gods or making up these other gods to try to grope, to try to find who God is. But it's so fascinating to me to see this the sovereignty of God moving in the story of humanity, and you really get that and as you're studying archaeology. So I guess I'm deepening my appreciation for His sovereign care, how He leads nations and people. That's fascinating to me. We do have to put up a lot with, but the past 30 years or so, maybe more, there's been sort of an attack against the Bible from some archaeologists and archaeological study. And I guess as I'm sitting in these classes, sometimes we have to deal a little bit with that and reconciling the chronologies, the conventional chronologies with biblical chronologies, and lots of things like that I'm trying to sort of navigate as we're going through. But I think overall, my confidence in the text of Scripture as I'm sitting in these classes continues to be reaffirmed and reaffirmed. Being at Hebrew University, it tends to be more of a conservative school in terms of archaeological study than perhaps Tel Aviv University or somewhere else. But but there's still sometimes some things that we have to deal with along that way. But I think what we find is, there have been attempts to disprove the Bible, or at least they say, here's this material culture that we found, and it's not consistent with the Bible, therefore we know the Bible's wrong. But the more we uncover, and truthfully, we've only uncovered just a bare little minimum of what could be uncovered in the land of Israel. The more we uncover, the more we're realizing that the Bible all along has stated what is true and what is right. And so I just continue to just reaffirm the integrity of the Scriptures in these classes. It's been really fantastic.
That's amazing. So, you were a person of faith before you went and began to study. This is enhancing your faith, you would say?
I think so. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
in part, it was in pursuit to bring some more understanding, cultural context, and geographic context to my study of the scriptures. And I feel like, it's been fantastic for my faith in terms of just seeing again the sovereignty of God and the integrity of the text of Scripture. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, that's great. So how long is your program?
Well, it's one full year, and it's 40 hours in 1 year. It's quite rigorous, but I'm trying to do a second year, and you have to sort of jump through some hoops and be approved for a second year in research, because I'd like to take what I'm learning this year and apply it on a specific and focused area of archaeology. I'm kind of interested in chronologies, though that's a very complicated science, but some other things as well I'm interested in. So we're going to see. I'm going to get through this year, and we'll see what the professors say, if they'll allow me into the second year for some research, and that would be another second full year here in Jerusalem.
Just for the people that are watching, listening, you're coming right physically from Hebrew University. So there's another little tidbit of information.
I'm in one of my classrooms
people
right now.
Yeah, very good, very good.
Right.
Excellent. Well, it's been great to have you, and we appreciate your time today. All the best in your studies, and we hope to come and see you there in Jerusalem soon.
I'll look forward to seeing you guys here in a couple of months. That'll be great.
Thanks for watching. You can listen to this entire podcast on your favorite audio podcast platform. Find the link below. And while you're at it, don't forget to click subscribe and follow us on Facebook so you can stay connected to First Century Foundations.